Montana Territory, 1878. The endless plains stretched like a sea of grass beneath the unforgiving summer sun. Mason Gentry stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, squinting at the horizon where dark clouds gathered. At 26, Mason had already carved out a respectable spread for himself, the Double G Ranch, but he'd done it alone. The way he figured, that's how it had to be. The frontier was no place for sentimentality. Out here, a man couldn't afford to let others get too close. It only led to heartbreak when the land inevitably took them. "Storm's coming," he muttered to no one. There was never anyone to hear him anyway. Mason was handsome in a rugged way that turned heads in town, lean but strong from honest work, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly when it grew too long. His jaw was usually clean-shaven, though by day's end a light stubble would appear. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, carried a wariness that belied his youth. Most women in Timber Creek found him appealing, but Mason kept his distance. He'd buried his parents 5 years ago after a brutal winter, and since then he'd learned his lesson. Attachments were dangerous. Better to focus on what he could control, his land and his cattle. The ranch was everything to Mason. It represented survival, independence, and the promise he'd made to his dying father: "Keep this land, son." It's all that matters in the end. Mason had taken those words to heart, perhaps too literally. The Double G was thriving, but Mason's life was hollow. Still, he told himself this emptiness was the price of security. Love had no place on the frontier. The following day, Mason rode into Timber Creek for supplies. The town had grown in recent years. A church, school, and even a small hotel now stood alongside the general store and saloon. Progress, they called it. Mason wasn't convinced. He tied his horse outside Miller's general store when he noticed a commotion near the hotel. A small crowd had gathered, their faces twisted with disdain. Curiosity got the better of him, and Mason approached. "Shameful, bringing her kind here," Mrs. Peterson was saying, her voice carrying across the street. "After what happened in Helena, she's nothing but trouble." Mason peered through the crowd and saw her, a young woman standing alone on the boardwalk, her posture straight despite the hostile stares. She couldn't have been more than 22, with golden blonde hair cascading in waves down her back. Her blue calico dress was simple but clean, and though she stood alone against the crowd, there was something defiant in the set of her shoulders. "What's happening here?" Mason asked Tom Miller, who stood at the edge of the gathering. "That's Sophia Valenti," Tom said, lowering his voice. "Sheriff brought her in from Helena yesterday. She's staying at the hotel until she can find work, but nobody's hiring. She was accused of theft back in Helena, worked as a maid for the Prescott family, and some valuables went missing. Nothing was proven, but her reputation's ruined." Mason studied the young woman. Her face was striking, not just beautiful but intelligent, with sharp green eyes that surveyed the crowd without flinching. There was something about her that didn't match the whispered accusations. "Seems like folks have already decided she's guilty," Mason observed. Tom shrugged. "That's the way of it. Nobody wants to take a chance on her, especially with unmarried men in their households. Women don't trust her, men don't dare hire her." Mason would have typically walked away. Other people's problems weren't his concern, but something about the injustice of the situation bothered him. Before he could think better of it, he found himself walking toward her. "Miss Valenti," he said, approaching carefully. Those green eyes snapped to his face, wary but direct. "Yes." "Mason Gentry. I run the Double G Ranch outside of town." He paused, surprised by his own next words. "I understand you're looking for work." Hope flickered briefly in her eyes before suspicion took its place. "I am, though I'm finding opportunities limited." "I need help at the ranch," Mason said, the idea forming as he spoke. "My housekeeper left last month to marry, and I haven't found a replacement. Room, board, and fair wages." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Why would you offer me work when no one else will?" It was a fair question, one Mason wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "I judge people on what I see, not what I hear. You need work, I need help, it's that simple." It wasn't that simple, and they both knew it, but desperation has its own logic. "When would I start?" she asked cautiously. "Today, if you're willing." Sophia glanced at the hostile faces around them, then back to Mason. "I accept your offer, Mr. Gentry." As they walked away from the crowd, Mason felt the weight of disapproving stares. He just invited a scandal onto his peaceful ranch, and for what? A strange sense of justice. Or was it something in those determined green eyes that had compelled him to act? Either way, it was done now. Mason Gentry, who had spent years ensuring he needed no one, had just tied his reputation to a woman the entire town had rejected. The ride back to the Double G was quiet. Sophia sat straight in the wagon seat, her small trunk secured in the back, containing what Mason assumed were all her worldly possessions. He found himself stealing glances at her profile, the straight nose, the determined set of her jaw. She was undeniably beautiful, but it was the quiet dignity she maintained that intrigued him most. "People will talk," she finally said, breaking the silence, "about you hiring me." "People always talk," Mason replied. "I stopped caring what Timber Creek thought of me long ago." "That's not entirely true," Sophia observed. "No one truly stops caring what others think. We just learn to pretend it doesn't matter." Mason gave her a sidelong glance, surprised by her insight. "You seem to know a lot about what people think." "When you're the object of gossip, you become a student of human nature." Her voice held no self-pity, just matter-of-fact acceptance. As the wagon crested the final hill, the Double G came into view, a modest but well-maintained ranch house, a large barn, corrals, and a bunkhouse where Mason's 2 ranch hands stayed. Beyond stretched the pastures where his cattle grazed, and in the distance, the mountains that had drawn him west as a boy with his parents. "It's beautiful," Sophia said quietly. "It's home," Mason replied, feeling an unexpected surge of pride seeing his land through new eyes. He showed Sophia to the small bedroom off the kitchen that had belonged to the previous housekeeper. The room was plain but comfortable, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the garden. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said awkwardly. "Supper is usually at 6, but—" "Well, I suppose that's your domain now." Sophia nodded, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed. "I'll have something ready, thank you, Mr. Gentry." "Mason," he corrected, then hesitated. "Miss Valenti, I don't know what happened in Helena, and I don't need to know. Your past is your own. All I ask is honest work." "That's all I want to provide," she answered, her green eyes meeting his directly. "And it's Sophia." That evening Mason returned from checking the herd to find the ranch house transformed. The floors were swept, the windows shined, and the aroma of beef stew filled the air. The rough wooden table was set with the good dishes his mother had brought west, dishes Mason hadn't used since her passing. Sophia moved efficiently around the kitchen, her blonde hair now tied back with a simple ribbon. She'd changed into a plain brown dress with a plain white apron. Something twisted in Mason's chest. His house hadn't felt like a home in years. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing his surprised expression. "I found these dishes in the cupboard." "They were my mother's," Mason said. "She'd be pleased to see them used again." Dinner was the first meal in years that Mason didn't eat in silence. Though neither was naturally talkative, Sophia asked thoughtful questions about the ranch, and Mason found himself explaining his operation with unexpected enthusiasm. She was an attentive listener, and Mason caught himself noticing the way the lamplight caught in her hair, or how her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled. "You've built something impressive here," she said as they finished the apple cobbler she'd somehow managed to prepare. "Especially for someone so young." "My father started it," Mason admitted. "I've just been trying not to lose what he built." "I think you've done more than that," Sophia observed. "This is clearly your ranch now, not your father's." The compliment warmed him more than it should have. Mason stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the feeling. "I should check on the horses before turning in." Outside in the cool evening air, Mason took a deep breath. What was he doing? He'd invited a stranger into his home, based on nothing but instinct and a sense of injustice. It was exactly the kind of impulsive decision he'd spent years avoiding. Connections led to pain. Hadn't his parents' deaths taught him that? Better to keep his distance, maintain a strictly professional relationship. But as he looked back at the warm light spilling from the windows of his home, Mason knew something had already shifted. Sophia Valenti had been in his house less than a day, and already the empty spaces seemed less hollow. Days turned into weeks, and Sophia proved herself invaluable. The ranch house had never been so well managed. Meals appeared like clockwork, everything was clean and organized, and somehow, she even found time to plant vegetables in the neglected garden plot. Mason's ranch hands, initially suspicious, were won over by Sophia's cooking and her lack of pretension. She worked as hard as any of them, rising before dawn and often still working when the sun set. Mason tried to maintain his distance, but it proved increasingly difficult. Sophia wasn't just in his house, she was changing it, bringing life back to spaces that had lain dormant since his mother's death. Mason would find himself lingering over breakfast, making excuses to return to the house during the day, or sitting in the kitchen while Sophia prepared dinner, just to share her company. One afternoon, a late summer thunderstorm hit without warning. Mason and his men were bringing in a small herd of strays when the sky opened. By the time they reached the ranch, they were soaked to the skin and chilled to the bone. Sophia met them at the door with towels and hot coffee. "There's hot water for washing up," she told them, "and stew that will warm you through." While the hands retreated to the bunkhouse, Mason followed Sophia into the kitchen, accepting the steaming mug she offered. Their fingers brushed, and he felt an unexpected jolt that had nothing to do with the coffee's warmth. "You should change before you catch your death," Sophia admonished, turning back to the stove. Mason nodded and headed to his room, but paused at the door. "Sophia." She looked up, a question in her eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Her smile was like sunrise after a long night. "You're welcome, Mason." That night, as wind howled around the house and rain lashed the windows, Mason sat by the fire while Sophia mended one of his shirts. The domestic scene struck him as dangerously comfortable. "Will you tell me about Helena?" he asked suddenly. Sophia's hand stilled, the needle poised mid-stitch. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "I worked for the Prescott family," she finally said, her voice even. "Mrs. Prescott's diamond earrings went missing. I was the obvious suspect." "Did you take them?" Mason asked directly. Sophia met his gaze unflinchingly. "No, I did not." "Then why?" "Why did everyone believe I did?" She resumed her stitching. "Because I was an easy target. I had no family, no connections, and because Mr. Prescott's son had been paying me unwanted attention. When I refused him, the earrings conveniently disappeared. Understanding dawned, so it was revenge." Sophia nodded. "The sheriff couldn't find evidence against me, but it didn't matter. In small communities, accusation might as well be proof." She tied off her thread and cut it neatly, rather like Timber Creek. Mason felt anger rising on her behalf. "That's not right." "Few things are, in my experience." She handed him his mended shirt, "but I've learned not to expect fairness." "Is that why you accepted my offer so readily?" "Despite not knowing me." Sophia's smile held a touch of sadness. "When you have nothing to lose, Mr. Gentry, even a risk looks like an opportunity." The way she said his name, slipping back to formality as if to create distance, bothered him more than it should have. "I believe you," he said quietly, "about the earrings." Something vulnerable flashed across her face before she composed herself. "That makes one person in 2 towns." "Make that 3 people," came a voice from the doorway. They both turned to see Sheriff Duncan removing his rain-soaked hat. Mason hadn't even heard him arrive over the storm. "Sheriff," Mason said, rising, "what brings you out in this weather?" "News from Helena," Duncan said, accepting the coffee Sophia quickly offered. "Miss Valenti, the Prescott boy, confessed to taking his mother's earrings. Seems he got himself in trouble with gambling debts and pawned them. When his mother noticed them missing, he blamed you to cover himself." Sophia sank slowly into a chair, her face pale. "He confessed." His father couldn't buy his way out of a different scandal in Butte, and the boy started talking to save his own skin. The sheriff looked genuinely apologetic. "Your name's been cleared, Miss Valenti. I came out as soon as I got the telegram, despite the weather. Figured you deserved to know right away." Mason watched emotions chase across Sophia's face, shock, vindication, and then, unexpectedly, tears. Without thinking, he moved to her side, a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for bringing this news, Sheriff," Mason said. "Will you stay the night? The storm's only getting worse." Duncan nodded gratefully. "If it's no trouble." Later, after the sheriff had been settled in the spare room, Mason found Sophia standing on the covered porch, watching the rain. The vindication from Helena had opened something in her. The careful guard she maintained had cracked. "What will you do now?" Mason asked, joining her. "Now that your name is cleared." Sophia kept her eyes on the falling rain. "Are you asking if I'll leave?" The question struck closer to Mason's fears than he cared to admit. "I suppose I am." She turned to face him then, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Do you want me to go?" "No," Mason answered, the word coming quickly, surprising them both with its intensity. "No, I don't want you to go." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. For years, Mason had built his life around needing no one, wanting no one close enough to hurt him when they inevitably left. Yet here he was, afraid this woman would walk away. "Then I'll stay," Sophia said softly, "at least for now." It wasn't a permanent promise, but it was enough. Mason nodded, afraid to say more, afraid to examine too closely the relief that flooded through him. As autumn painted the mountains in golds and reds, life at the Double G fell into a rhythm. Sophia's position evolved from mere housekeeper to something less defined but more essential. She managed the household accounts, helped plan improvements to the ranch, and even assisted with the ranch's correspondence. Mason found himself consulting her on decisions he'd previously made alone. In town, attitudes toward Sophia gradually shifted. The news from Helena had forced many to reconsider their judgment, though some still viewed her with suspicion. Mason noticed how she held herself when they went to town together, chin up, shoulders back, refusing to be diminished by lingering doubts. "You don't have to accompany me every time," she told him one day as they loaded supplies into the wagon. "I can manage the shopping alone." "I know you can," Mason replied, "but I prefer to come." The truth was, he enjoyed their trips to town. He liked watching Sophia charm the shopkeepers who had once shunned her, liked the quiet conversations on the drive back to the ranch, liked being seen with her. It bothered him how much it bothered him when men in town took notice of her beauty. On one such trip in late October, they encountered James Harker, the wealthiest rancher in the territory and Mason's nearest neighbor. Harker was in his 40s, a widower with a reputation for hard dealings and a spread 10 times the size of the Double G, Gentry. Harker nodded, then let his gaze linger on Sophia and Miss Valenti. "I've heard about you." "Mr. Harker," Sophia acknowledged coolly, "I understand you run a fine household for young Gentry here," Harker continued. "I've been looking for someone capable to manage my home. The pay would be considerably better than whatever Mason can afford." Mason felt his jaw tighten, but before he could speak, Sophia answered. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harker, but I'm quite satisfied with my current position." Harker raised an eyebrow. "The offer remains open. A woman should consider her future security." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Mason. "Some spreads have better prospects than others." After Harker departed, Mason found himself unusually quiet on the ride home. Harker's words had struck a nerve. The Double G was prosperous but modest. What future could Mason offer Sophia compared to a man of Harker's means? "You're brooding," Sophia observed as they neared the ranch. Harker was right, Mason admitted reluctantly. "He could offer you more security than I can." Sophia studied him. "Is that what you think I want, the biggest house with the wealthiest man?" "I don't know what you want," Mason said honestly, "but everyone wants security. You said yourself you accepted my offer because you had nothing to lose." "That was then," Sophia said quietly, "when I knew neither you nor this place." She looked out at the land that was becoming as dear to her as it was to Mason. "There are different kinds of security, Mason. Not all of them can be measured in acres or dollars." Something warm unfurled in Mason's chest at her words. He wanted to ask what she meant, what kind of security she did value, but they were already pulling up to the house, and the moment slipped away. That night Mason couldn't sleep. Harker's offer had forced him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding for weeks. The thought of Sophia leaving for Harker or anyone else was becoming unbearable, but what right did he have to hold her? He employed her, he didn't own her, and if he wanted something more, he'd have to risk the careful walls he'd built around his heart. The next morning, Mason rode out early, needing time alone to think. He found himself at the small family plot where his parents were buried, a peaceful spot overlooking the valley. He hadn't visited in months, which suddenly struck him as a betrayal. "I don't know what to do," he said aloud. "I've spent years making sure I didn't need anyone, and now." The wind whispered through the grass, offering no answers. Mason remembered his father's last words, "Keep this land, son. It's all that matters in the end." But sitting here, he wondered if his father had been wrong, or perhaps Mason had misunderstood. Maybe his father hadn't meant the land was all that mattered, but rather what the land represented. Home, family, something worth fighting for. When Mason returned to the ranch house, he found Sophia in the garden, gathering the last of the season's vegetables before the first hard frost. The sight of her there, so naturally belonging, made his decision clear. "Sophia," he called, approaching her. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "You were gone a long time." "I had some thinking to do." Mason took a deep breath. "Harker's offer yesterday made me realize something. I don't want you to stay just as my housekeeper." Sophia stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "What are you saying, Mason?" "I'm saying," he faltered, then steadied himself. "I'm saying I've spent years believing that caring for people was a weakness I couldn't afford. That attachment only led to pain. But I was wrong. Being alone, that's the real weakness." Sophia stepped closer, her expression guarded yet hopeful. And I care for you," Mason admitted, "more than I should as your employer, more than I've let myself care for anyone in years." The basket of vegetables slipped from Sophia's grasp as she reached for his hand. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I have for some time." Mason brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a small gesture, but it broke something open between them, a door neither had been brave enough to open until now. Their first kiss came later that evening, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge. It was tentative at first, then deepened with all the longing both had kept carefully contained. When they finally pulled apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I've spent so long keeping people at a distance." Sophia smiled. "We'll figure it out together." As winter descended on the Montana territory, the Double G transformed. Mason moved Sophia's things to a larger bedroom, though they both knew it was a temporary arrangement until they could marry in the spring. Propriety still mattered, especially as they began to be accepted as a couple in town. The scandal of Mason hiring the disgraced Sophia Valenti had evolved into a romance that many now found charming, the young rancher who saw the truth when others couldn't. Not everyone approved, of course. James Harker, in particular, seemed to take their relationship as a personal affront. When Mason and Sophia attended the Christmas social at the church, Harker made a point of mentioning loudly that some men would take any woman willing to warm their bed. Mason nearly confronted him, but Sophia's hand on his arm held him back. "He's not worth it," she murmured. "His opinion doesn't matter." But Harker's hostility wasn't merely wounded pride. Mason discovered in January that Harker had been systematically buying up the small ranches bordering his property, expanding his empire. The Double G, with its strategic water access, was clearly in his sights. "He offered to buy the Wilsons' place for half what it's worth," Mason told Sophia one evening. "They were desperate after Tom's accident and took it. Harker's getting too powerful. If he controls all the water access in the valley." "You won't sell," Sophia said with certainty, "no matter what he offers." Mason nodded. "This land is my promise to my father, to my family." He took her hand. "To our future family." The words hung in the air between them, full of promise. They'd spoken of marriage, but not yet of children. The idea of filling the ranch house with new life both terrified and exhilarated Mason. Sophia's eyes softened. "I'd like that," she said simply. The first sign of trouble came in February. Mason discovered several head of cattle missing, their tracks leading toward Harker's property. When he rode to the Harker ranch to inquire, he was met with denial and barely veiled threats. "Cattle wander," Harker said coldly. "Perhaps if you couldn't afford proper fencing, you should consider selling to someone who can maintain the property correctly." Mason returned home frustrated but determined. "He's trying to pressure us," he told Sophia that night. "Make things difficult enough that selling seems like the only option." "We won't let him," Sophia said firmly. "The Double G is our home." "Our home." The words warmed Mason even as worry gnawed at him. Harker was powerful, with connections throughout the territory. The pressure continued through February. A mysterious fire in one of Mason's outlying hay barns, rumors spread in town questioning the ranch's financial stability, and more missing cattle. Sheriff Duncan was sympathetic but had no proof of Harker's involvement. "I need evidence, Mason," he said regretfully, "not just suspicions." In early March, with spring still just a promise on the horizon, the situation escalated. Mason's two ranch hands, Tom and Charlie, were ambushed while checking fence lines. They returned to the ranch battered and angry. 4 of Harker's men, Tom reported, holding a cloth to his bloodied lip. Said we were trespassing, but we were well within our boundary. They're pushing to see how far they can go, Sophia observed after tending to the men's injuries, testing whether you'll fight back. Mason knew she was right. This was the frontier way: intimidate, threaten, and if that didn't work, escalate until your opponent broke or fought. Either way, Harker would claim justification for whatever came next. I won't risk the men, Mason decided. From now on, no one rides alone, and we'll arm ourselves. That night, Mason checked every window and door before joining Sophia by the fire. The worry in her eyes matched his own. Perhaps we should send for help, she suggested. Your father's old friends, or... No, Mason shook his head. This is my fight, our fight. I won't hide behind others. Sophia took his hand. There's a difference between hiding and accepting help, Mason. Your determination to face everything alone, it's admirable but sometimes misguided. Her words stung because they held truth. Wasn't this the very lesson he'd been learning since she entered his life? That independence didn't have to mean isolation. We'll wait, he compromised. If things get worse, we'll consider reaching out. They didn't have to wait long. 2 nights later, they woke to the sound of gunfire. Mason grabbed his rifle and rushed outside to find the corral fence broken and horses scattering into the night. In the distance, riders were driving the animals toward the eastern hills. Harker, Mason growled, raising his rifle. Mason, don't, Sophia caught his arm. That's what they want, to provoke you into doing something that will justify retaliation. She was right, but the helplessness burned like acid. They spent the rest of the night rounding up the scattered horses, and by dawn, Mason's patience had reached its limit. I'm riding to town, he announced. This has gone far enough. Sheriff Duncan needs to intervene, evidence or no. Sophia nodded. I'll come with you. No, Mason said firmly. I need you here with Tom and Charlie. Keep the rifle close. She wanted to argue, he could see it in her eyes, but she understood the necessity. Be careful, she said, reaching up to straighten his collar in a gesture so domestic it made his heart ache. Come back to me. Mason kissed her quickly, always. The ride to town gave Mason time to cool his temper and think strategically. Confronting Harker directly would only escalate the situation. He needed allies, witnesses, legal protection. Sheriff Duncan was his first stop, but the lawman's office was empty. Mason headed to the telegraph office instead, sending messages to the territorial marshal and to an old friend of his father's who now served as a judge in Helena. It was mid-afternoon when Mason finally located Sheriff Duncan at the saloon, deep in conversation with none other than James Harker himself. The 2 men looked up as Mason entered, and something in their expressions sent a chill down his spine. Gentry, Harker nodded, a smug smile playing at his lips. We were just discussing your situation. My situation, Mason kept his voice level despite the anger churning inside him. Sheriff Duncan looked uncomfortable. Mason, perhaps we should talk privately. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Harker, Mason insisted, since he seems to be at the center of all my recent troubles. Harker chuckled. Such accusations, Sheriff, you see what I mean about his unstable temperament. Duncan sighed. Mason, I've received some concerning reports. Threats made against neighboring ranchers, cattle with altered brands, even rumors about the true nature of your relationship with Miss Valenti. Mason stared in disbelief. These are lies, Harker's lies. Perhaps, Duncan allowed, but I have multiple witnesses, Mason, respectable men in the community. Men who owe Harker money or favors, Mason countered. This is a coordinated effort to discredit me, to pressure me into selling the double G. Harker spread his hands innocently. I merely expressed concern to the sheriff about your increasingly erratic behavior. If you're experiencing financial difficulties that are clouding your judgment, my offer to buy your land still stands. Mason stepped closer to Harker, hands clenched at his sides. The double G is not for sale. Not now, not ever. Every man has his breaking point, Harker replied softly. Even your father understood that in the end. The implication struck Mason like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Your father came to me the winter he died, Harker said, watching Mason's reaction with obvious pleasure. Begged me to buy his worthless land. I declined. It wasn't worth my trouble then. Imagine my surprise when his stubborn son turned it into something valuable. You're lying, Mason hissed. Ask around, Harker shrugged. Your father was desperate that winter, everyone knew it. He would have sold to save your mother, but he couldn't find a buyer in time. He leaned closer. Your precious land meant nothing to him when it mattered. Remember that before you risk everything and everyone to keep it. It took every ounce of Mason's restraint not to strike Harker. The thought that his father, the man who had told him with his dying breath to keep the land, might have tried to sell it was unbearable. But was it true? That final winter had been brutal. His mother had fallen ill first, then his father. They'd had no money for a doctor from town. This changes nothing, Mason finally said. The double G is mine now, and I won't be intimidated into selling. As Mason turned to leave, Sheriff Duncan caught his arm. Mason, be careful, he warned quietly. Harker has powerful friends. I can't protect you if this escalates further. Then who will? Mason asked bitterly. Isn't that your job? Duncan had no answer, and Mason departed with a growing sense of dread. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, his mind racing with Harker's revelations and the implied threats. Had his father really tried to sell? And what did Harker mean about risking everyone? The threat to Sophia was barely veiled. As the double G came into view, Mason's heart stopped. Black smoke rose from the direction of the main house. No, he shouted, spurring his horse to a gallop. The scene that greeted him was chaos. The bunkhouse was engulfed in flames, and in the yard, Tom was struggling with two of Harker's men while Charlie lay motionless on the ground. Of Sophia there was no sign. Mason leaped from his horse, tackling one of Harker's men to the ground. Where is she? He demanded, pressing his arm against the man's throat. Where's Sophia? The man choked out a laugh. Boss has her. Said to tell you the price of stubbornness just went up. Cold fear replaced Mason's rage. He knocked the man unconscious and helped Tom subdue the second attacker. Charlie was alive but badly injured, a deep gash across his forehead. They came for the horses first, Tom explained, breathing hard. When we tried to stop them, they set fire to the bunkhouse. Miss Valenti came running from the house with the rifle, but there were too many, 5 or 6 of them. They took her, Mason said. Harker wanted to discuss terms personally. Get Charlie to the doctor, Mason ordered, already heading for his horse, and find the sheriff. Tell him Harker's kidnapped Sophia. You can't go alone, Tom protested. They'll kill you. Mason checked his revolver and mounted his horse. If I don't go now, they'll kill her. The Harker ranch was an imposing spread with a main house, 3 times the size of Mason's modest home. As he approached, Mason saw numerous men patrolling the property. Harker was expecting him. Direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, Mason circled to the back of the property, using the lengthening shadows of evening as cover. He left his horse hidden in a small grove and approached on foot. Lights blazed from the main house, and through a window, Mason could see Sophia seated in what appeared to be Harker's study. She was unbound but clearly not free to leave, with a guard positioned by the door. Even from a distance, Mason could see the defiance in her posture. Getting inside undetected would be nearly impossible with so many men watching the property. Mason was considering his options when he heard a twig snap behind him. He whirled, drawing his gun, only to find himself facing Sheriff Duncan. I figured you'd come straight here, Duncan said quietly, hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. Put that away before someone sees. Mason lowered his weapon warily. Are you here to arrest me or help me? Help you, you damned fool, Duncan replied. What Harker's done crosses every line. I've sent for the territorial marshal, but he won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest. Sophia doesn't have until tomorrow, Mason said grimly. Duncan nodded. I know. That's why I brought this. He produced a folded document from inside his coat. Arrest warrant for Harker, signed by Judge Peterson this afternoon. Turns out your telegram stirred up some interest in Helena. The judge sent a reply to my office while you were confronting Harker. Hope flared in Mason's chest. So you'll arrest him. We'll arrest him, Duncan corrected, but we do it by the book. No vigilante justice, Mason. Harker needs to face a proper trial, or he'll just use his connections to escape consequences. Mason wanted nothing more than to put a bullet in Harker, but he knew the sheriff was right. What's the plan? I've got 4 deputies surrounding the property, Duncan explained. On my signal, we move in together. Harker's men are hired guns. Most will scatter rather than risk hanging for their boss. The plan was sound, but Mason couldn't shake his fear for Sophia. And if Harker threatens her when we enter? Duncan's expression darkened. Then you do what you need to do. But try to leave him breathing. Dead men can't stand trial. They moved into position, the sheriff signaling his deputies with a small mirror catching the last rays of sunlight. On Duncan's mark, they converged on the house from all directions. The element of surprise worked in their favor. They reached the front door before Harker's men could organize a defense. Duncan kicked in the door, shouting, "James Harker, I have a warrant for your arrest." The ensuing chaos was brief but violent. Two of Harker's men drew weapons and were promptly disarmed by the deputies. Others fled through the back. Mason pushed past the commotion, heading straight for the study where he'd seen Sophia. He burst through the door to find Harker holding Sophia in front of him, a revolver pressed to her temple. Her lip was split and a bruise was forming on her cheek, but her eyes were clear and focused on Mason. "One more step and she dies," Harker snarled. Mason froze, his own weapon half raised. "Let her go, Harker, it's over. The sheriff has a warrant for your arrest." Harker laughed bitterly. "It's never over for men like me, Gentry. Money buys second chances." "Not this time," Sheriff Duncan said from behind Mason, his rifle steady. "The territorial marshal is on his way with a federal warrant. Judge Peterson has frozen your assets pending investigation. Your friends in Helena have abandoned you." Uncertainty flickered across Harker's face, but he pressed the gun harder against Sophia's head. "Back off, or I swear I'll kill her." "Then you'll die 2 seconds later," Mason promised, his voice deadly calm. "Is that how you want this to end?" Something in Mason's eyes must have convinced Harker he meant every word. The older man's resolve wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Sophia acted. She drove her elbow hard into Harker's ribs and twisted away as he gasped in pain. Mason lunged forward, tackling Harker to the ground as his gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. "Sophia," Mason called, struggling to subdue the larger man. "I'm all right," she assured him, backing away as Sheriff Duncan and his deputies rushed in to secure Harker. Once Harker was restrained, Mason pulled Sophia into his arms, holding her so tightly she protested she couldn't breathe. He relaxed his grip but couldn't bring himself to let go, his hands running over her as if to reassure himself she was truly unharmed. "Did he hurt you?" he demanded, gently touching the bruise on her cheek. "Nothing that won't heal," Sophia replied, leaning into his touch. "I knew you'd come." "Always," Mason promised, resting his forehead against hers. "I will always come for you." Dawn was breaking when they finally returned to the Double G. The bunkhouse was a charred ruin, but the main house stood undamaged. Charlie had been taken to town for the doctor's care, but would recover. Tom had organized the remaining ranch hands to secure the property. Exhausted beyond words, Mason and Sophia sat on the porch steps, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink. Despite everything, the land endured. It would take work to repair the damage Harker had done, but they would rebuild together. "Harker told me something in town," Mason said finally, "about my father. He said my father tried to sell the ranch that last winter before he died." Sophia took his hand. "Do you believe him?" "I don't know," Mason admitted. "That winter was desperate. My mother was sick, then my father. We had nothing left, but his last words to me were to keep the land." "Why say that if he'd been willing to sell?" "Perhaps," Sophia suggested gently, "he learned what truly mattered in those final moments, not the land itself, but what it represented." Mason looked at her questioningly. "Home," Sophia explained. "Family, something to pass on. The land was never just land to your father, it was his legacy, his gift to you. Maybe he considered selling it to save your mother, but in the end, he entrusted it to you because he knew you would understand its true value." As the sun rose fully over the Double G, Mason felt a weight lift from his heart. The ranch was his responsibility, his legacy, but it wasn't his whole world, not anymore. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Not in the spring, now, this week." Sophia laughed in surprise. "What's the rush?" "No rush," Mason smiled, pulling her close. "I just don't want to wait. I've spent too many years keeping people at a distance, believing I had to face everything alone. I was wrong. This land, this home, it means nothing without someone to share it with." "Yes," Sophia whispered against his lips. I'll marry you, this week, today, whenever you want." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Timber Creek. Sheriff Duncan stood as Mason's best man, and to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Peterson, once Sophia's harshest critic, helped arrange the flowers and stood up with the bride. The town had rallied around them after Harker's arrest, perhaps eager to distance themselves from their previous judgments. James Harker was transported to Helena to await trial, his empire already crumbling as investigations revealed years of illegal activities. The land he had acquired through intimidation was returned to its rightful owners or sold at fair prices. The Double G remained intact, stronger for having withstood the threat. 1 year later, Mason stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching Sophia in the garden. Her belly was round with their first child, due in the early autumn. The bunkhouse had been rebuilt, better than before. New cattle grazed in the pastures. The scars of Harker's attack were healing, just as the wounds in Mason's heart had healed under Sophia's care. "What are you thinking about?" Sophia asked, noticing his gaze as she approached the porch, one hand supporting her back. Mason helped her up the steps, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against him. "I was thinking about magic," he admitted. "Magic," she repeated with amusement. "I didn't take you for a fanciful man, Mason Gentry." "Not that kind of magic," he clarified, his hand resting on the swell of their child. "The kind that happens when a stubborn rancher opens his heart to a woman everyone else rejected. The kind that turns a house back into a home, and a man who thought he needed no one into a man who found everything he never knew he was missing." Sophia's eyes softened. "That does sound like magic." "It is," Mason insisted, drawing her into his arms, "the most powerful kind." As the sun set over the Double G Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant golds and pinks, Mason knew with absolute certainty that his father would approve of how he'd kept his promise. The land was still here, still in family hands, but now it was more than just land. It was the foundation of a future, a home filled with love, and the setting for a new chapter in the Gentry family story. Some in Timber Creek still called it unlikely, the handsome young rancher and the woman nobody wanted finding happiness together against all odds. Others called it destiny, but Mason and Sophia Gentry knew the truth. What had happened between them wasn't luck or fate or even love at first sight. It was simply the magic that occurs when two people find in each other exactly what they need, exactly when they need it most.